What is up, my friend? Welcome to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger, and this is Basement Brood Fantasy Football. Thank you so much for being here. Seriously, every single time you tune in, every time you listen, every time you watch, you're genuinely helping me chase a childhood dream, and I cannot thank you enough for that. Seriously, thank you so much. This is episode 3 of the Basement Brood Fantasy Football Podcast. Episode 2 covered the Buffalo Bills, and frankly, it was rather boring. Not because the Bills are boring, they're the most exciting team in football from a fantasy football standpoint, but I was boring because it was my second episode, and I learned a lot that I will be implementing here in this third episode. So if you've joined me once again, and if you tuned back in after listening to episode 2, thank you for not giving up on me so soon. This one should be a heck of a lot better. Today we're going to focus on the Miami Dolphins, which is one of possibly the most fascinating football team in 2022 fantasy football. I published an article yesterday morning. The link, once again, it's in the description of this podcast. It's in the description of YouTube, so you can find it easily, or just type in basementbroodff.com and click on content, and it'll be the teal and orange that you see right in front of you right away. But yeah, today we're going to dive into the Miami Dolphins, and first and foremost, we should talk about what's changed, right? And there's been quite a bit of change in Miami since last season. So for starters, Brian Flores is out. Mike McDaniel is in. So Mike McDaniel, if you're not familiar, he coached under Kyle Shanahan for the last 11 years. They spent time together in Washington, Cleveland, Atlanta, and then the last several years in San Francisco. He is most likely going to be bringing a run-heavy offense and a run-heavy approach that we'll get into a little bit more in a minute. The Dolphins completely revamped their entire roster as well on the offensive side of the ball. So they lost Devontae Parker and Mac Hollins, but they upgraded both of those guys with Tyreek Hill and Cedric Wilson. They also brought in 3 free agent running backs, Chase Edmonds, Sony Michel, and Raheem Mostert, who spent the last 5 years with McDaniel in San Francisco. So the arrow in general is pointing straight up on the Miami Dolphins as a team and as on the offense as a whole. But how is that going to shake out from a fantasy football standpoint? Obviously, time will tell, but that doesn't mean we can't speculate. So let's start with the running backs on the Miami Dolphins because it's going to cover an important philosophical shift for the team as a whole. So I mentioned earlier that McDaniel is very likely to bring his run-heavy scheme with him to Miami. In his first season as an offensive coordinator last year in San Francisco, Mike McDaniel had the 5th most rushing attempts, the 7th most rushing yards, the 6th most rushing touchdowns, and the 8th most rushing first downs. So he had a very, very run-heavy approach last year in San Francisco. It seems very likely that he brings that to Miami as well. Elijah Mitchell was the lead back for most of the season for San Francisco last year. He finished as the PPR RB17, so a solid RB2. He scored 14.2 PPR points per game, and in 3 games that he missed, one of his teammates was able to step up and hit at least 14 PPR points 3 different times. So there's definitely fantasy football value to be had in that backfield if one of those 3 free agents that they brought in is able to grab a stranglehold of that, lead RB role, if somebody emerges as that clear leader. So the first up and the most likely candidate to be that guy looks like it's going to be Chase Edmonds, and that is solely if you follow the money. So Chase Edmonds' contract guaranteed him $6.1 million, which was the most by far among him, Raheem Mostert, and Sony Michel. So if you follow the money, it certainly looks like it's going to be Chase Edmonds who gets the first crack as that lead back duty. So Chase Edmonds is currently drafted as the RB36 around pick 113. So that's the 10th round. He was last year in Arizona as a part-time player splitting time with James Conner. He finished as the RB25, and he's being drafted as the RB36. Actually, in the last 2 years, consecutive years, Chase Edmonds has finished as the RB25 in PPR points per game. And again, he's being drafted as the RB36. Elijah Mitchell was the RB17, Chase Edmonds was the RB25 and the RB25, and he's being drafted as the RB36. So I am all in on Chase Edmonds at that cost, and to be completely frank with you guys, I haven't been to this point. I've actually passed on Chase Edmonds more often than not. Not anything against him. It had more to do with the names that were available around that spot, but I mentioned in my article, if you check it out, that I am actually going to be making a more concentrated effort on getting more exposure to Chase Edmonds as the summer wears on. Raheem Mostert, on the other hand, right? There's always the scenario of what if, and what if Raheem Mostert, who spent the last 5 years with Mike McDaniel, so there's some, intimate familiarity there. Terrible choice of words. You get what I'm saying. There's some familiarity there, and he's significantly cheaper than Chase Edmonds, who's already cheap to begin with. Raheem Mostert is currently drafted around RB56, which is around pick 187 in the 16th round. He's a terrific dart throw for zero RB drafters who are looking for, typically if you're playing a zero RB model or a hero RB model, what you want to do is target ambiguous backfields where there's a lack of clarity. It's not entirely clear who's going to be the clear-cut, RB1. You want somebody who's capable of catching passes and, frankly, somebody who's capable of emerging as the lead back. It doesn't look like it's going to be Raheem Mostert, but it certainly can be. What if he outplays Chase Edmonds? What if that familiarity with Mike McDaniels takes over and he ends up playing well ahead of Chase Edmonds, and now he's going in, the 16th round. Same would go for Sony Michel. He's even cheaper. He's the RB62 around pick 206 in the 18th round. He's one of my favorite super late round dart throws. You could absolutely do a heck of a lot worse for a late round running back with some upside. As for Myles Gaskin, I'm ignoring him completely. He's super cheap. He's basically free in best ball drafts, but why would Miami and the new coaching staff bring in 3 free agent running backs if they were sold on Myles Gaskin? So, all in all, obviously we know Miami's going to be, we think we know Miami's going to be bringing a run-heavy approach to the Miami Dolphins. So how is that going to affect the passing game? So if you look at Mike McDaniel's 49ers last year, again, it was his first year serving as an offensive coordinator, and his 49ers ran the 7th fewest plays in football at about 61.5 plays per game. Compare that to Brian Flores, the Dolphins coach last year. He ran the 11th most plays at about 64.5 per game. McDaniel's 49ers had the 4th fewest passing attempts last year, while Brian Flores's, that's a tough one, his Miami Dolphins had the 9th most passing attempts, right? So it seems likely that the Dolphins are going to be shifting from a pass-heavy approach over to a run-heavy approach, and that's a little bit concerning when you consider the fact that Tua Tagovailoa has been mostly underwhelming to this point in his career already, and now he's going to be the quarterback in an even slower, run-heavy, less pass-heavy offense than he has been in the past. So zeroing in on Tua Tagovailoa, he has finished as the QB 24 last year, so the bottom barrel QB 2. And in the year before that, he finished as the QB 34, which was his rookie campaign in 2020. On Reddit, after I posted the article on Reddit, somebody had commented saying that they feel like Tua Tagovailoa has one of the safest floors among quarterback, has a very low ceiling. And I have to say, I actually disagree with that wholeheartedly. So Tua has played in 23 fantasy football games. He's never, ever hit 30 points. So, yeah, you could definitely agree that the ceiling's not there, although that might change with the addition of Tyreek Hill and, he's got Jaylen Waddle. So that could totally change, but he's never hit 30 points. He has hit 20 points just 17% of the time, and he's hit 15 points just in less than 50% of his games that he's played. So you definitely can't really assume a safe floor with Tua Tagovailoa, at least until you see it. The guy's not even scoring 15 points in half of his games. Now, that all being said, this theoretically should be the best season of Tagovailoa's career, right? He finally has the backing and the faith of the organization, right? For For the last year, the last 18 months, it sounded like the Dolphins were serious about possibly trading for Deshaun Watson, and they just never seemed fully committed to Tua. That has finally changed, at least it seems. He has a creative head coach. He has that revamped artillery with, Tyreek Hill coming in. He's got all the they added Cedric Wilson. He's got all those running backs, and he's got that deep backfield, like I just mentioned. Now, as for the fantasy football side of things, Tua is currently the QB 17 around pick 132, which is the 11th to 12th round turn. That price is fine if you're assuming he's going to take a step forward and perform better with his revamped artillery. The price itself is fine, but it is worth noting that you can also get guys like Trevor Lawrence, Jameis Winston, Matt Ryan, Zach Wilson, Mac Jones, Carson Wentz. All of those guys are typically drafted after Tua Tagovailoa. And he's also usually drafted around some names that carry some intrigue like Dameon Pierce, Ronald Jones, Rashad White, Jamison Crowder, Jacoby Myers, and some others. So for me personally, I think the price is completely fine for Tua, but it's not one that I personally am paying too frequently when you think about some of the other names that you can get later and some of the other names that are drafted around the time that Tua is. As for Tyreek and Jaylen Waddle, the biggest, I think possibly the biggest question in fantasy football heading towards the season is, can Tua Tagovailoa support too elite, too expensive, too high-priced wide receivers? So Tyreek Hill is typically drafted in the second round, and Jaylen Waddle is typically drafted right around the third and fourth round turn. So those are two very, very high-priced wide receivers. Last year, Tua did produce one elite wide receiver, which was Jaylen Waddle, right? Jaylen Waddle finished as the wide receiver 6. He averaged about 15.6 PPR points per game. He was very good. And for that matter, Mike McDaniel, as the head coach, he produced an elite wide receiver as well. He had Deebo Samuel, who finished as the wide receiver 3 with 20.7 points per game. Granted, that was heavily buoyed by 320 rushing yards and 7 rushing touchdowns, but who's to say the Dolphins wouldn't creatively use Tyreek Hill or Jaylen Waddle in the same way? So it's very possible that one of these guys carries a ceiling that's similar to what Deebo Samuel did last year. But what about wide receiver 2s? So last year, Tua Tagovailoa, his second best wide receiver was Devontae Parker. Parker finished as the wide receiver 41, averaging about 11.1 PPR points per game. That's fine. That's a wide receiver 4. That's there. That's not what you would want to spend on your second round or third round pick on, but it's there. And then in San Francisco, Mike McDaniel's wide receiver 2 was Brandon Naiuk, who finished as the wide receiver 56, averaging about 9.6 PPR points per game. So when you look at the coach and you look at the quarterback, at least to this point, there's a lot of skepticism about whether or not they can fully support 2 wide receivers, let alone 2 elite and high-priced wide receivers. And don't get me started on wide receiver 3. You can completely forget about Cedric Wilson, to be honest. And of course, you could say, hey, this is a whole new situation, right? This is a whole new team, a whole new scheme, a whole new offense, and you'd totally be right. Technically, you'd be right. This is a whole new situation. But if you look at it, the Miami Dolphins, the 2022 Miami Dolphins look a lot like the 2021 San Francisco 49ers. There's question marks at quarterback at best. There's hope and there's optimism, but question marks. There's a running back by committee and an unclear backfield scenario. There's an elite wide receiver and 2 really solid options in the passing game. And there's a respectable tight end catching passes, which we'll get to in a minute. So if you think about it, the 2022 Miami Dolphins seems eerily similar to the 2021 San Francisco 49ers. And if that is the case, then the Dolphins are going to be run heavy. They're not going to pass too much. And there's no way they will be able to support both Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle at the costs that they're being drafted at right now. Currently, like I mentioned, Tyreek Hill is drafted in the second round. He's usually drafted around pick 21 as the wide receiver 9. Jaylen Waddle is drafted as the wide receiver 16 around that third, fourth turn, around pick 36. And I think both of those guys are being drafted at their ceiling already. And by the way, if one of those guys hits their ceiling, the other won't. To me, it doesn't seem likely or probable at all that both of those guys are able to meet expectations of second and third round ADP. Personally, I'm cringing anytime I'm put in a position where I basically have to take Tyreek Hill, and I ask myself, do I really have to take him, or is there somebody else here? Usually I'm passing on him when guys like Aaron Jones, Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift, Mike Evans, Keenan Allen, when those names are available, I'm leaning that way and passing on Tyreek Hill altogether. Likewise, Jaylen Waddle, I'm usually cringing and passing on him if I can find Michael Pittman, Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, Terry McLaurin, and more. All of those guys are usually drafted at about the same cost or maybe even a little bit later. Last but not least, we'll wrap this thing up with Mike Gesicki. So in 2 seasons with Mike Gesicki, he has finished as the tight end 13, which was last year. He averaged about 10.1 PPR points per game. And the year before that, he was the tight end 9, where he finished with 10.6 PPR points per game. Excuse me, I mixed the years up. Last year, he was tight end 9. The year before that, he was tight end 13. He has played in 31 fantasy football games since Tua came into the league. Not all of those games are with Tua, but he's played in 31 since Tua came in. He's never, ever hit 30 PPR points. He's hit 20 PPR points in 12.9% of his games, and he's hit 10 or more PPR points in 35.5% of his games. Now, with Mike McDaniel in town, it's easy to get really excited when you look at George Kittle, right? George Kittle finished as the tight end 3 last year, 14.8 PPR points per game. But is Mike Gesicki George Kittle? Absolutely not. Not even close. I like Gosicki. I think he's ultra talented. He's a great football player, but George Kittle is on a whole nother level as far as tight ends go. So A, he's not George Kittle. B, Miami bringing in Tyreek Hill moved Gosicki from second in the pecking order to third at best. If he's running ahead of Cedric Wilson, he's third at best in the target pecking order. The Dolphins are shifting from a pass-heavy team to a run-heavy team. So if you think about it, that means lower passing volume for the team, lower individual passing volume for Mike Gesicki himself, and all of that is terrible news for a guy who usually butters his bread on targets. Last year, he had 108 targets, which was the third most among tight ends. He had 71 catches, which was the fourth most. He had 758 yards, which was the 7th most. And the guy doesn't score touchdowns. He scored 2 last season, which tied for 34th most, quote-unquote, most in football among tight ends. So he butters his bread on volume, and volume looks like it's going to take a significant dip this year, both from a team standpoint and from an individual standpoint. In current fantasy drafts, he's drafted as the TE12 around pick 132, which is the 11th round. I'm totally fine with that price. That price is reasonable. It seems like the public is also expecting a somewhat decline for Mike Gesicki. The price itself is fine, but it's also worth noting that check out this list of names that you can get after Mike Gesicki in early best ball drafts and early fantasy football drafts. You can get Irv Smith, Cole Kmet, Robert Tonyan, Albert O., Hunter Henry, and no, I'm not going to try and pronounce Albert O's last name. Albert O., Hunter Henry, David Njoku, Gerald Everett, Tyler Higbee, Noah Fant, Evan Ingram, Cameron Brate, Logan Thomas, and Austin Hooper. All of those guys can be drafted after Gesicki, and a lot of those guys are drafted much, much, much cheaper than the 11th round. So I'm out on Gesicki. I'm out on Tyreek Hill. I'm out on Jaylen Waddle. I'm all in on Chase Edmonds, so at least there's that. But that's a wrap on the Miami Dolphins. Again, there's a heck of a lot more detail in the article that I published in the description of this podcast. And again, you can always just go over to basementbroodff.com and click on content. You'll find it there. Next up in this 32-team series is the New England Patriots, and I'll be posting that article on Friday morning and releasing the next podcast episode on Monday. So keep an eye out for both of those things. And in the meantime, please, 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 this means so much more than you might think. please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a review, sharing with your non-competing friends. And also, in the meantime, in between episodes, come hang out with me on Twitter. I'm at BBFFMikey. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate that you were able to join me in the basement, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys again on Monday. Cheers. This brew's for you.